Smoke curled out of the chimneys like whispers from a restless past. And in the town of Nottingham, a boy named Thomas paced the muddy alley behind his family. Weaving shed the whirring sound of machines echoed from the factory down the lane louder each week, drowning out the hum of hand looms that once sang the songs of his father and his father's father. He was just 17, and yet his hands bore the calluses of years bent over frames, spinning threads into cloth with patience and pride, now that pride was shrinking, replaced by fear and anger, because something was coming. Something no one had the courage to name, but everyone could feel it tickling the edges of their lives like a thief in the night. The machines were not merely tools. They were threats. They had come from the north, rolling in with men in fine coats, holding papers that gave them power and the backing of the crown. These machines could do in hours what a dozen hands took days to finish. They did not stop. They did not eat. They did not sleep. And worst of all, they did not care. Families that once worked together in harmony were being cast aside, replaced by the deaf clatter of gears and cogs. Thomas saw it firsthand when his uncle George, a master weaver, was dismissed after 30 years. The factory owner simply said, "Business is business," before locking the gate with George still pleading for mercy. That night, in a candle-lit shed, a secret gathering took place. Thomas, his uncle, and others from their village sat in silence as a hooded man stepped forward and placed a hammer on the table. The room held its breath. The man spoke, his voice rough, like worn wool. He said, "The machines have no soul, and neither do the men who run them. They feed on our hunger. They live on our silence. We must fight not with swords, but with message. Let them hear the sound of splintered wood. Let them fear the name Ludd." The name sparked something in Thomas. It was just a whisper, a legend. They said he was a weaver like them who had smashed the first frame that took his job. Some said he was a ghost. Some said he never existed. But tonight, he was a symbol. They needed someone to believe in, and if no one else would rise, they would carry the name forward like a banner in the fog of war. By dawn, the town stirred to news that 3 knitting machines had been destroyed, broken beyond repair. The constable sniffed the remains like a hunting dog, muttering about traitors and radicals. He asked the crowd, but no one spoke. They just watched as the wind scattered wood chips. Like dry leaves, that first act was just the beginning. Within weeks, similar attacks echoed across the Midlands and Yorkshire. The government called it treason. Parliament passed laws giving the death penalty to frame breakers, but still the machines kept falling. Still, the name Ludd kept appearing carved into doorposts, scrawled in soot across factory walls, whispered in the wind like a promise. Thomas and his companions moved at night cloaked by darkness, guided by moonlight and rage. They planned each strike like soldiers, not for violence but for message. They never harmed workers. Only the machines, they believed, were stealing their future. They wore scarves over their faces and carried the hammer with reverence as if it were a sacred relic. And when the job was done, they vanished into the woods like ghosts. But it could not last forever. One night in March, the factory owner, Mr. Cartwright, hired soldiers to guard his mill. Thomas and the others approached carefully. But as soon as they reached the walls, gunfire erupted. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and screams. Thomas was hit, his arm burned, but he ran bleeding through the trees, clutching the hammer like it was his heartbeat. 2 of their group were caught, dragged away in chains. The others scattered like frightened birds. In the days that followed, fear settled over the town, like winter frost. The soldiers questioned everyone, searched homes, rounded up men without cause. Mr. Cartwright stood tall on his steps and declared, "We will not be intimidated." But even he could not ignore the looks in the streets, the eyes that no longer feared machines but feared what those machines had awakened in men. The people were changing. The silence was cracking, and the name Ludd was no longer a whisper. It was a roar rising from the earth, from the broken looms and bleeding hands. Thomas hid in the cellar of a distant farm nursing his wound, and listening to news from the outside. They say, "Parliament is sending more troops." They say they want to hang someone to make an example, but they do not understand. This is not just about cloth or work or wages. It is about dignity, about the right to survive in a world that no longer values human hands. Thomas knew then the hammer was not just a weapon, it was a story, and he was not ready to let that story end. The sun rose slow and blood-red over the hills of Yorkshire as Thomas stepped back into the world after, weeks in hiding his face thinner, his spirit sharper. He had changed, and so had England. The papers called them rebels, criminals, enemies of progress, but in the villages they were heroes. Men whispered the name Ludd, like a hymn. Women tucked food into sacks for the cause. Children drew hammers in the dirt when no one was looking. The machines had not stopped, but neither had the people. This was not just resistance. Now it was a movement, one fueled by desperation and bound by brotherhood. In the town of Huddersfield, a new mill was being built taller than any before, with steel locks and guards stationed at all hours. Thomas stood on the ridge with a group of men, 30 in total, all sworn by silence and unity. This was their message to the crown, not in words, but in action. They moved like shadows, slipping through fog, armed with nothing but hammers and ropes, hearts pounding like drums in a storm. When the gates broke open, it felt like thunder. The factory roared with shouts, but there were no screams, no blood, just the sharp sound of splintering wood as iron machines met oak-handled fury. But someone had spoken. Someone had broken the oath. The militia was waiting in the shadows with orders to shoot, and this time they did. 2 men fell where they stood, and a third never made it out. Thomas felt the fire in his lungs as he ran faster than ever down the muddy path through thorns and over stones until the sounds of death faded behind him. He did not cry. He did not look back. There was no time for grief when the law called your name. They placed rewards on the heads of the Luddites and made public hangings a spectacle. Coaches filled with curious onlookers while soldiers dragged the accused to the gallows. Thomas watched from the crowd, once eyes wide as a boy. While the noose tightened around the necks of his friends, his soul cracked, but did not break, for he knew this was not the end. The name Ludd would not die on a rope. It would live in the wind, in every broken gear and every fire-lit tale told by those who remembered. He traveled further north to Leeds, then to smaller towns where resistance still burned quiet and steady. He found others like him, weavers, blacksmiths, even young apprentices who had seen their fathers starve. He taught them not just how to break a frame, but why to never touch a man who worked, but to strike only at the things that silenced his craft. This was about making them listen. Not about hate, it was about justice. One night, as snow fell in sheets, Thomas sat with a boy named Eli, barely 15, who asked, "Will they ever stop building the machines?" Thomas looked into the fire and said, "Maybe not, but we will not stop reminding them what it cost them to build them. Maybe one day they will listen, not just to what we broke, but why we broke it." Years passed. The movement began to fade. Not in heart, but in numbers, as laws grew harsher and lives were lost. The world kept moving and the machines kept multiplying. But in books and whispers the name Ludd remained, and in every strike, every labor union, every protest that came after, you could feel the echo of hammers on steel, the mark of those who dared to say no in a world that demanded yes. Thomas never returned home. He became a myth to many, a ghost to others. Some said he fled to America. Others swore he lived among miners in Wales. But for those who truly knew him, he was never gone. He was in every hand that reached for dignity, in every voice that demanded fairness, and in every dream that asked for more than survival. The Luddites were not just frame breakers. They were soul keepers, defenders of a dying age who tried to hold back a tide, not because they feared the future, but because they feared a future without honor. They lost in the eyes of kings and courts, but in the hearts of those left behind, they won something deeper, a place in the roots of resistance. And so the story ends, not with a shout, but with a whisper in the wind that carries through fields and factories past power lines, and electric hums through the cold walls of modern cities where workers still dream of justice, and somewhere maybe in the crack of a broken gear or the swing of a silent hammer. The name Lud still lives waiting to be heard again,